Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Nathan Porter, and I'm a fellow of Creature Kind and a student at Duke Divinity School. And on behalf of Duke and Creature Kind, I'd like to welcome you to the second dialogue in our series, Christianity in an Age of Factory Farming. Today, we're honored to have joining us Professor Ellen Davis and the Reverend Dr. Sam Wells, who will be discussing the interpretation of Scripture and the role of the preacher in the Christian response to industrialized agriculture. Professor Davis is the Amos Reagan Cairns Distinguished Professor of Bible and Practical Theology at Duke Divinity School and the author of 11 books, including Scripture, Culture, and Agriculture, and most recently, Opening Israel's Scriptures. Professor Davis is also an acclaimed preacher and has published 2 books on homiletics as well as a collection of her sermons. The Reverend Dr. Sam Wells is vicar of St. Martin's in the Fields, a church in central London, and visiting professor of Christian ethics at King's College London. He's a renowned preacher and the former dean of Duke University Chapel in Durham, North Carolina. And Dr. Wells is the author of 35 books, including works on Christian ethics, mission, ministry, liturgy, and preaching. His recent books include Incarnational Ministry, How Then Shall We Live, a Nazareth Manifesto, and 2 volumes of liturgical prayers. Now, please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Professor Davis and Dr. Wells. We're so very glad to have you with us. Now, we'll have time for Q&A after the discussion, and I would ask that the audience enter its questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom window. You don't have to wait until the end of the conversation to submit questions, but we'll get to them in around 20 to 25 minutes. Now, with that, I'd like to begin with a question for you, Professor Davis. The Christian understanding of creation has come under severe criticism for its traditional emphasis on the superiority of humans to other animals. And Genesis 1, with its claims about human dominion over the created order, has usually served as the scriptural locus of this view. Now, how do you, as an Old Testament scholar, understand this difficult text? And does possession of the Imago Dei really grant us unrestrained license to exploit other creatures?
As you'd expect, I'm going to begin by quibbling with the way you posed the question.
Okay.
So I would say that in that, in your formulation of it, Christian understanding perhaps means a modern Western perspective, and perhaps not really a traditional perspective on this. I think that view of humans being superior to animals in a sort of blanket way is not prevalent in pre-modern communities, which live as people in the biblical world lived in an interdependent relationship with animals. And yet, having said that, there is no question that the first chapter of the Bible takes what modern ecologists would call a special species perspective, that humans are distinct and distinctive within creation. We're the only creature created in the image of God. Whether we succeed in realizing that image is an open question from Genesis 1, but that certainly is the intention for humans. I would say that with respect to the notion of dominion, as we frequently speak of it, it's important first to separate the idea of dominion from domination. And Jesus Christ is Dominus Dominorum. He is Lord of Lords and King of Kings. And so if you think of from a traditional Christian perspective, that's the model for what dominion looks like. In the context of Genesis 1, you need to connect that idea of what's sometimes called dominion. I translated exercise, skilled mastery. You need to connect that notion to the overall context of blessing in Genesis 1. Blessing being always in the Bible is an acknowledgement of the creatures' power, when it is creatures who are blessed, it's an acknowledgement of their power to thrive and a commitment to the flourishing of the creature by God. So perhaps that's what it means for humans to be created in the image of God, that we are a creature that can consciously perpetuate blessing. You can't image God while harming what God blesses. Perhaps that's enough to begin.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, you mentioned the New Testament just a bit ago, and of course, Paul refers to Jesus as the image of God. So, could you go into a little more detail on that? What does, from a biblical theology perspective, um, what does the New Testament understanding of Jesus as the image of God add to our understanding of dominion?
Um, Jesus is God taking a full place amongst the creatures, taking on the vicissitudes of flesh. One might say that if in Genesis, God makes a covenant with all flesh, in the incarnation, to put it crudely, God puts skin in the game. And so it's a very, it is a profound deepening of God's covenantal commitment to all flesh.
Thank you very much, Professor Davis. Now, Dr. Wells, in one of your recent books, you've argued that the Christian understanding of creation should be incarnational, informed by the fact of God's presence in the world as Jesus Christ. Now, how does the scriptural claim that God has come to live among us reconfigure our relation to the created order?
Well, I think I'd nuance Dr. Davis's remarks in a slight way, if I could presume to do so, which is for me, Jesus, God being with us, is the reason for creation. And so all the image of God language and all the creation language is Christologically determined. So there's only one thing that makes humans special, and that is that we are in the image of Christ. You know, we are the species that Christ came to be among, as one among us. And so we take our lead from Christ, and that's where I'd agree 100% with Dr. Davis that our interaction with the rest of the creative order is Christ-like. And as one theologian puts it, in it there is no un-Christ-likeness at all. So if our interaction with the creation isn't Christ-like, that's a good sign that it's off kilter. So I understand our relationships as characterized by being with one another, and I understand that eschatologically, because I think in forever, in heaven, if you think of it like that, we are with God, ourselves, one another, and the creation. So our lives, the kind of appropriateness, the righteousness, if you like, of our lives today can be evaluated to the extent that they match up to the way our lives will be forever. And our lives forever, this is where we then make a kind of a move to employ Augustine's distinction between what we use and what we enjoy. So for Augustine, what we use is a means to an end. It doesn't last long. It's a step on a ladder that we climb up to get somewhere else. Whereas what we enjoy is an end in itself, and it lasts forever. Now, clearly, in a sentence, that the problem we're talking about today is that humans have used animals rather than enjoyed them. Simple as that, really. And what that means in more complex terms, and terms that I'm sure not everybody would agree with me about, would be that I think you can actually configure our notion of sin around these two terms of using and enjoying, so that we can understand two kinds of sin, first of which is to use what should be enjoyed, and the second is to enjoy what should be used. So the first we could call blasphemy, and the second we could call idolatry. I can take that a bit slower if you like. So when we use what should be enjoyed, the definitive, and here I'm on Dr. Davis's territory, the definitive form of that is to take God's name in vain. But I think we can extend from that to there are many things that should be enjoyed, one another. And today we're talking about the animal creation, which are to be enjoyed. Not, we're not sitting in the theatre applauding. It's not that kind of enjoying, but is to be treated as ends in themselves, to be relished in for their own sake. I often say my aspiration for my congregation is, they wouldn't use these words on the whole, but if they, were big fans of Augustine's on Christian doctrine, they would say, everywhere else in my life I'm used, here at St. Martin's I'm enjoyed. So that, that's your aspiration. It is that kind of full sense of enjoyment. But clearly we sometimes use what should be enjoyed, and that's a broad understanding of blasphemy. And that also, alternatively, we sometimes enjoy what should be used. We adore our car, for example, and wash it every Sunday morning or something like that. That's idolatry. So, I guess what I'm trying to construct is a kind of theological field within which we can understand the issues we're talking about today, which are, it seems to me, once one recognizes that the animals are gifts to human beings to exercise blessing, as Dr. Davis has beautifully put it, and to be enjoyed, to use Augustine's language, although it needs to be emphasized that he wouldn't have used it in that way because he thinks God is the only thing to be enjoyed. But I think we can extend it, from that place quite successfully. Then the question is, what form does that enjoyment take? In a world where people need to find food and flourish. That's where I think that, to me, the point that the animals are there to be enjoyed isn't a point for discussion. That's a theological no-brainer for me. The point that of what that actually entails in terms of vegetarianism versus eating meat, veganism, all the kind of issues in the back of this conversation, that's up for discussion as far as I'm concerned. But it's getting to a place where we enjoy the creation rather than use it.
It's a very interesting distinction because, of course, many people would say that they enjoy very much what they get from creatures that are exploited from factory farming, for example. So it sort of requires a different understanding of enjoyment. And would you want to say something about, just briefly, what the specifics of that might look like?
Well, I mean, in very simple terms, and people can make their own analogies about other spheres of human interaction, which I'm not going to go down unless you push me, because it's not the subject for today. But it's almost a definition of enjoyment that the other person is having a good time too. Otherwise it's use. So I think the pig is probably not having a fantastic time in some of the contexts that are in our minds in this kind of conversation. So in this sense, that rules out a notion of enjoyment. When you enjoy a sunset and you take it in all its glory, we're not worried about the sun having feelings, but in a sense, in a teleological sense, in other words, what's its real purpose? The sun is being the sun. It is being beautiful and creating light and heat to its full extent, and we are responding by seeing it as a feature of God's blessing and leading us to worship not of the sun but of God. And that, that seems to me a paradigm of how it kind of works when it's working as it's supposed to. To say I really enjoy a steak on a Friday evening is in a theological sense a misuse of the term enjoy. Doesn't mean you don't like the steak. Good, obviously, quite understandably. But that's not what I mean by the word, or that's not what Augustine means by the word enjoy.
Yeah.
But Sam, use is not the emphasis on enjoyment does not make use a negative category.
No, there's very appropriate things to use. I mean, you should use a car. You shouldn't enjoy a car in that sense. To the extent that you enjoy a car, you're always bordering on idolatry, and there are things that are very important to use. And so, that in that sense, it's that balance to what extent some element of use in relation to animal creation is appropriate. It's never appropriate in relation to humans, always appropriate in relation to, technology or something of that kind. And then the gray areas in ethical discussion today are the sentient and non-sentient creation, to what extent those simply are enjoyed, and to what extent, like crops, like corn, an element of use is perfectly appropriate. But when it comes to my pet puppy, for example, any sense that I might be using rather than enjoying that puppy is troubling. So then the question becomes, why do I think that about the puppy and not about the pig?
The notion of pets is, I won't say it didn't exist in the ancient world, but as far as I know, it did not exist in ancient Israel. I'm not quite sure how Egyptians viewed their cats. But I think that from an Israelite perspective, I'm not aware that animals would have been enjoyed in the way that you might enjoy Ruby, because, and yet they were lived with in the house. And there were not barns that were across a field or, across the barnyard. The animals were in the house. And so people lived with their animals in a conscious interdependency. I have to believe that there was a measure of enjoyment in that, but that primarily it was a matter of caretaking for the purpose of use. And of course, the violation of that is abuse. And so not letting animals keep Sabbath, that would be abuse. Balaam beating the ass, that's abuse. The closest I think I've seen in a modern context to that attitude toward animals would be what I've seen in South Sudan. And one of my colleagues said to me, in the towns, animals are abused, donkeys are beaten in a way that never would have happened in the village, which I found really interesting, because in the village, your life is integrated with the cows and the donkeys. Whereas town life separates those, even in a place that is still largely informed by traditional values, such as Sudan and South Sudan. Whereas for us, we've really lost that concept of living in an interdependent relationship with animals, except for our pets, but that's a very special instance.
Now, Professor Davis, you've written a fair bit on sacrifice in the Old Testament, and that is some texts that are problematic for a lot of people, because it looks as though it's hard to square the value of animals in God's eyes with the prescriptions that are provided in the Old Testament for animal sacrifice. Could you say a little bit about how you address those texts?
Sure. I'm not aware that I've written a lot on sacrifice, but I'm certainly willing to give it a go. I mean, first of all, we're using an English word based on Latin, but I think it captures the notion of the biblical notion. Sacrifice means making holy. And the word, I was just reading Leviticus with my students yesterday, and the word that is used for sacrifice is to bring near. And the sacrifice itself, the hakriv, is to bring near, and the sacrifice itself is called korban. It is a bringing near thing. So it is through sacrifice that we draw near to God, at least potentially draw near to God. And if God wills it. What you bring in sacrifice, first of all, probably most sacrifices were vegetable sacrifices. Some were animal sacrifices. And most of those sacrifices were not burnt up. They were consumed by the priests or the other personnel associated with the sanctuary, or they went into the sanctuary was kind of like a treasury, kind of like the national treasury. So they went into the revenue streams, you might say, if it belonged to the king. But the important point is that most of the sacrifice was consumed, and most of it was consumed in community. Much of it was consumed in community in an act of thanksgiving. From a biblical perspective, with our meat markets are sacrilege because they separate the notion of, as Dr. Wells was saying, if we receive animals as a gift, then in sacrifice, we are giving back the best of the animals as a gift to God. And Leviticus is very clear, you cannot consume blood because the life of the enfleshed animal is in the blood. So always there is a reminder that we are enfleshed creatures amongst other enfleshed creatures. It's a kind of enactment of our, in a sense, I think it's a reenactment of Genesis 1. That's very, very different from what we think of when we imagine sacrifice, but we're really imagining it from in view in our imaginations of the meat counters at the supermarket.
That's true. Now you described the consuming of a sacrifice as a communal meal that involved Thanksgiving, and that of course evokes for many Christians the Eucharist. Now, some people have suggested that eating itself has a sort of sacramental character, and for Christians, there is at least one meal that definitely is a sacrament. But do you take eating in general to have this sort of sacramental nature, and especially in relation to sacrifice in the Old Testament?
I'm going to tread carefully here because I am a layperson and an Anglican, and I'm speaking in the presence of my priest, so Dr. Wells. So I'm going to be cautious about identifying sacraments too broadly. But I think there is the very act of saying grace over a meal, which many of us do, is at least a faint echo of of both sanctuary sacrifice and, in a sense, a faint echo, perhaps, of what we do in Eucharist. I would say I'm more comfortable in saying that any meal is an opportunity to participate in creation in a way that can either be blessed or is a desecration. And then depending upon how high church you are, you can decide if that's a sacrament or not.
Dr. Wells, do you have anything to add to that?
Oh, well, I mean, they sometimes say of Anglicans that you have to believe two impossible things about the Eucharist to be an Anglican. You have to, first of all, believe that that wafer is actually a piece of bread, and then you secondly have to believe that it's the body of Christ. And some people find the first one harder to believe than the second. I think Dr. Davis has put it very well. That what I'd add to that, I think, is to say that if you, I think the easiest way I find to express this is to think about what I would call a crib scene and you would call a creche scene. That's to say, Mary and Joseph in the stable as displayed at the front of a church or outside a home or something like that. So that is, the coming together of a man and a woman, the coming together of the rich magi and the poor shepherds, the coming together of the animals traditionally, and the humans, the coming together of heaven and earth fundamentally, of God and humanity. So in a sense, that's like a kind of epitome of what an altar should be in a Eucharist, where the bread and the wine, the toil of the bread and the celebration of the wine, they are come together, and then each person finds their place in the world, if you like, around the altar table. And in other words, we discover why we have food when we share the Eucharist. It's not that we know what food is, and the Eucharist is this funny kind of food with a wafer and so on. It's that we understand what the Eucharist is, which is us being face to face with God, the fullness of our humanity coming face to face with or the divinity of humanity coming face to face with the humanity of divinity, if you want to put it like that. And so likewise, every meal is in some ways, or ideally should be, Dr. Davis has pointed out that it might be quite the opposite. It should be that kind of harmony of creation where the goodness of what the soil produces finds its telos, finds its fulfillment on the dinner table. And then just as in the Eucharist, we trace all the way back to the Last Supper, all the way back to the manna in the wilderness, and we trace all the way forward to the kingdom banquet. When we say grace, we do that similarly at the dining table, where we trace the number of people involved in the agricultural production and transportation and retail of these things that we're eating, and then the lives that we're going to live in the strength of the blessing we've received from the food and one another's company. And all of that is in the notion of the word companion, which of course means the one with whom you share bread, and also friend. So it's a focal moment. I think, sacrament, it's an interesting conversation. It's a sacrament with a small s, shall we say. But I'd see it as a sort of focal moment, and the key part is that sort of tracing back and tracing the wider ramifications. So another way to describe it is as a profoundly political act. That you could say obviously I'm coming from a Christian ethics background, that if we get our eating right, then we get our living right. That food is politics, and the way, and you can see it, a lot of that in the Emmaus story, but all the, the Emmaus story, I think, is the 8th meal in Luke's gospel, the 7th being the Last Supper. You can see the construction of that. But the point, for the sake of today's conversation, clearly about animals, is if we get our eating right, then we get our living right.
I know, Nathan, you want to move on to a conversation, but if I could just respond to that for a moment. I think there's a strong biblical argument that if we, eating is a profoundly political act, and it's also the core of our religious action. I'm thinking about Exodus, that the first act of the people Israel in freedom, the first thing they have to get right is their eating. They cross chapters 14 and 15 of Exodus, they're crossing the Red Sea, the Reed Sea, and immediately in chapter 16 come the manna regulations. So if you're going to be a people in freedom, then you have to figure out how to eat in such a way that everyone has enough and no one has too much. And when the Israelites, of course, don't get it right away, God says, how long are you going to be contemptuous of my statutes, my Torah? And building off that, the rabbis say that Torah was not given at Sinai except to the eaters of manna. If you couldn't get eating right, then there's no point in talking to you about all the rest of it.
That's very helpful. Now, before we move on to the Q&A, I do have a question, since our conversation is in fact entitled Preaching in an Age of Factory Farming. Dr. Wells, you are not afraid to preach on difficult topics, and Professor Davis, several of your sermons in your volume also include topics such as these. Now, how can preachers address these questions with their church in a way that is both, pastorally sensitive to the fact that it's such a difficult topic for people, but also that confronts people with what you, I think, Dr. Wells, have rightly understood as sin? Can you give some practical pointers there?
Well, I've jotted down, in advance of today, I jotted down 10 commandments, because, commandments tend to come in tens. And I'm just going to quickly run through them because they'll take 2 minutes. And then I'd like to make some, they're not specifically about factory farming, but they apply to any difficult subject, really. And then I'll make some comments, I think, about factory farming. So the first, I'm just going to run through them quickly. So first of all, get a reputation for your understanding and insight in scriptural exegesis, theological nuance, and pastoral depth before you take on edgy, divisive subjects outside the regular theological orbit. 2, don't take on a big, weighty subject more than one time in 10. 3, gauge the views of a dozen diverse congregation members in advance to assess their fears and learn from their own investment in the issue, integrating their wisdom anonymously as appropriate. 4, publicize your sermon theme in advance through website, email, and social media, so that those for whom the issue is sensitive can keep their distance if they want or need to. 5, don't make stray references to big subjects in sermons that distract from whatever else you're saying and can't possibly do justice to a complex issue. 6, don't pretend to be neutral when you're not. 7, remember the personal is the political. It's more helpful to empower people to reflect on particular changes in their lives that together make a big difference than to call on faraway people who aren't listening to change the world all at one go. 8, if you're so passionate about an issue that you can't speak charitably about those who take a different view and can't in any significant way present another perspective than your own, it may be best to handle a difficult subject through a town hall or open microphone style meeting than through a sermon. 9, never underestimate the diversity of even the most apparently monochrome congregation. Be very careful about using the word we. And 10, don't call on everyone else to change but yourself. An argument carries a lot more weight if you say, and I recognize to uphold this policy is going to require sacrifices from you and from me. So, those are my 10 sort of guidelines. If you don't follow those guidelines, people won't hear your sermon. They will see you as a person who's determined to turn the rest of the world into a version of yourself. And you'll have lost out many ways. I'm very happy to share those 10 commandments. So speaking more specifically to this, I think we've actually covered the ground about preaching on this. I think this arises from, what Professor Davis just shared about manna, coming before the 10 commandments, filling most of the space between Exodus 14 and 15 and Exodus 19 and 20. Says a lot of what needs to be said, really, which is to say, if you're preaching about manna, if you're preaching about eating, if you're preaching about Emmaus, there is a lot of eating in the Bible. And a passage I think that recently came up in the lectionary that I think is very suitable is 1 Corinthians 8, where we're talking about food sacrificed to idols, and obviously Professor Davis's remarks are very apposite for that. What you're looking to see is how can our eating be a genuine celebration of our discipleship and of our community and of our dependence on God, rather than something that's none of anybody else's business and is done in the privacy of my home, and it's not up to you to criticize. So that's more about a way in which it's almost like a Lenten theme of how could we spend this Lent eating better. And it gives you a chance to demolish some wrong kinds of eating better. Eating better isn't looking like the person on the front of Vogue magazine. That's an idolatrous kind of eating better. I'm not saying that person isn't a happy person to be on the front of Vogue magazine, but we're never all going to look like that. I'm certainly not. And so that's a false god. But there are some better gods, including the real one. And so in a sense, it's a good Lenten theme to say, what's one thing we could take each week about food, some of which are about who we eat with, some of which are about how we cook, some of which are about where we shop, and some of which may actually about what we eat.
That is just very helpful. Is there, would you be willing to share your 10 commandments?
Sure,
not on tablets of stone, perhaps, but on...
Yeah, I wrote an article in an Episcopal church book a year or two ago, which some people here might not have seen, because it's I think the book's called Political Preaching or something. I'm just going to paste them in the chat just as we're talking now. I've edited them down. They're far longer than we'd want to look at today, but if they're helpful to people, I'm happy to paste them in.
Yeah, that would be very helpful, and we can also send them out to attendees afterwards. So, well, if we are ready to move to Q&A here, we have a question from Sam Shamlin. I hope I'm getting that right. He says, I very much appreciate the notion of enjoyment and the idea that enjoyment should be reciprocal in an ethical framework. However, that enjoyable relationship often entails hardships and struggle. Anyone who has cared for livestock knows the hard hours and heavy labor involved in providing enjoyment for animals. It very much is a giving of our life for theirs. Now, can we think of ethical meat consumption as reciprocal enjoyment and sacrifice?
I think yes. I mean, I think I was thinking. This has been such a stimulating thing to be asked to talk about. I I went back to Jayber Crow, Wendell Berry's novel, and its portrayal of, I think the characters are Jayber, Mattie, and Troy, Mattie's husband. Although it's no secret that Jayber's rather fond of Mattie all the way through, and that Troy's a cad. But the portrayal of those different characters, I think I will preach a sermon on that book sometime, even though I read it 20 years ago. And thanks to this conversation, because it brought, I was trying to say, where is it portrayed? And this can be, again, a technique in preaching, is that you talk about the book, and therefore you don't get finger wagging, or you don't get shout outs for all the great farmers, yay, farmers. You don't get into that. You just say, here are three approaches to life. One is very much the using, which is Troy. I think he's called Troy. One is a person who seems to enjoy everything appropriately, which is Mattie. Very faithful, beautiful life. And then we've got Jayber, who's this, the central character, who's kind of got a bit of both about him. And I think you can, in terms of offering a portrayal for people, then you can do the stuff, that the questioner's asked about, without saying, I think farmers are marvelous and they're underappreciated and they keep our country's belly funk, without doing that kind of stump speech. You can say some gentle things that just turn the prism round to different points of view, and offer people perspective. And a lot of the work is done, as clearly Black Lives Matter is shown in a very extreme way, but it is often done in subtle ways around all sorts of issues, by just showing the world from a different perspective. How does it look like to be a farmer right now? But I think narrative, somebody else's narrative, the danger slip into is to make it all about me, and how can I make my body perfect by only eating the right foods and by finding yet another way to show that I'm more righteous than everybody else on social media. That's the direction we don't want to go.
Absolutely. Professor Davis, we have a question for you here as well. Have you explored, this is from Edward Hopkins, have you explored Temple Grandin's work, and would you be willing to comment on it?
Explored would be stretching the truth. I am somewhat familiar with her work. I've read an article by her and probably another one about her, so I'm slightly familiar with her work. And she's actually she is an interesting person to bring into this conversation, because she is not herself a farmer, but she has a deep identification in a certain way with animals. And as I understand it, as someone who is on the spectrum and processes information and relationship in a way that is somewhat unlike the norm in our society, that is part of what has enabled her to think of what it would be to be an animal, and be frightened in an animal in a factory farming situation. And so that ability to move outside of the sort of normal industrial human range of thought to identify with another creature, I find that a profoundly moving thing. I want to go back, I think, to what we were just talking about in connection with this, because as I understand it, it has then enabled her to think about how animals should be slaughtered in a way that is not terrifying for them. I took some of my students, I was teaching in New Zealand, and I took some of my students to visit a farmer who was a deacon in the Anglican Church in New Zealand. So he was, he had a theological education, and his day job was running a sheep farm and caring for the animals. And he said, this is my ministry. And I want my animals to have a good life. And yes, many of them will be slaughtered. And so we watched him slaughter an animal. And that was, since we were many of us in the group were meat eaters, I thought that we ought to be willing to see that. And it was farmers that I have known on several continents who live with their animals. All of them feel that they have some kind of identification with their animals in the way that I was mentioned of Temple Grandin. The most extreme of that perhaps would be farmers in South Sudan, who often share their names with their animals. The cows and the humans have the same names, and it is an honor to take the name of the most beautiful bull. That seems to me to be, of course, there's a recognition of a difference between animal and human life, and these are Christians. And at the same time, there's a recognition of a profound interconnection, and this word I keep using, interdependency. I think that is something that Temple Grandin has made us more aware of and extended. As a farmer for whom I have a great deal of respect and fondness, Wes Jackson says, you always have to extend the boundaries of consideration. And she's extending the boundaries of consideration with respect to our practice of empathy. And I think that's a valuable and deeply human and humane act.
Thank you, Professor Davis. We have a question here from Tyson Roseberg, who is a priest in a rural curacy in Quebec, Canada, and a wannabe farmer. I'm just reading the question here. This discussion is fabulous and life-giving, he says, and I wonder if we can link some of the Old Testament prophets and Israel's relationship with the land to our current 2021 pandemic world. Professor Davis, I'm guessing this is in your area.
Talk about extending the boundaries of consideration. Well, I think what I'm going to say is, and I don't know how I'm going to bring this into our current pandemic world, but, well, we are aware that as best we know, the pandemic is related to the destruction of habitat of animals, and intermixing of human populations and wild animal populations in ways that had been at least exceptional in traditional cultures. And that destruction of habitat is a result of in the ancient world, kings were the great arbiters of power. In our world, multinational corporations are probably the greatest arbiters of power, of economic power. And And the Old Testament prophets are the prophetic movement in Israel, which really begins to gain ground probably in the 9th century, and the earliest writing prophets that we have, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, Micah, these are 8th century prophets. They are responding to a very great extent to the destruction of a locally based, regionally based, land-based, and animal-based economy. That economy being taken over by, being centralized and taken over by the king, to put it sort of too simply. And so they are speaking for the little people, the subsistence farmers by the whole, whether they are in the city or whether they are in the village. And I would say then that the agrarian movement, the neo-agrarian movement in our country, is again speaking for the small farmers. It's speaking for communities of eaters, not just people who work the land, but people who need access to healthy food wherever they are, including in our cities. That, I think, is a task that the prophets of the Bible understand very well.
Thank you. We have time possibly for one more question. Dr. Wells, if you think you have time to answer this one. It's from Nathan Brassfield, who asks whether preachers should focus more on the ecological and environmental destruction of factory farming, or on the ethical problems of the treatment of animals.
Could you just say that one again? Because I just want to check I answer it appropriately, since we haven't got much time.
Yeah, well, perhaps it's because the talking about animal suffering in particular is a much more controversial issue among people than discussing simply the environmental impact.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, it's the difference between what I would call ecclesial ethics, sometimes called virtue ethics in a theological vein, and consequential ethics. You know, we can always rally around consequential ethics quite easily because the planet's falling apart. It's our grandchildren aren't going to have a world to live in. You know, it's not too hard to sell that one. Well, you wouldn't think it would be. Obviously, there are tremendous vested interests who've created confusion around that. But it's it's pretty straightforward. Whereas the other part is a more of a virtue ethic. In other words, what kind of a person do you want to be? What constitutes a good life? And what Professor Davis just described with that beautiful description of the I think seminarian who saw this as part of his ministry to be a shepherd farmer, is a beautiful life to live. Now, people will have different view about whether a shepherd farmer should eat lamb. That's an interesting discussion to have. But once you've then transferred to the humane killing of animals as part of that, you've clearly made a step in a good direction, however far you think that direction should go. So I think we're in the business as pastors of cultivating beloved communities. We want to create, as one famous theologian puts it, communities of character. And so it seems to me undeniable that as part of those kinds of communities, we should seek the flourishing of all people and of all creation. Just as we would hope that all people and all creation would seek our flourishing. isn't that a better way to live in? You know, the alternative to that is the sort of none of your business ethics, which has reached its kind of high watermark, I would imagine, in the, you know, I'm not wearing a mask mentality, as if life was simply about my right to express my wishes, rather than my duty to care about your well-being as much as my own. You know, it's love your neighbor. Hello, sunshine. It's not that complicated. It's there early on in the Bible. It gets repeated a couple of times as well. So, you know, I don't think you have to choose between those. I do think, you know, you kindly referred to my book Incarnational Ministry. I wrote another book called Incarnational Mission. I had to make a choice where creation would lie in which of those books. The first one subtitled being with the church, the second one subtitled being with the world. I put it in ministry because it's a kind of discipleship. You know, this is about us being with God, being with ourselves. This is about being a good human being. When you call it an ethical issue, it's about saving the planet, and suddenly it's panic and it's urgency and it's climate emergency and all of that. And in the end, of course, that's self-serving. So it's, you know, kind of not really ethics at all. It's really just enlightened self-interest. So I put it in ministry because I do think that our relationship with creation is fundamentally part of our understanding of God and how to relate to God. And just to state the obvious, I think the person that understands the need to diminish the necessity for animals to suffer is probably a person who gets the climate emergency arguments quite easily.
Thank you so much. And it looks like we're out of time, but I want to again express the enormous gratitude of Duke and Creature Kind to Professor Davis and Dr. Wells for joining us today. And I've learned a lot, and I do hope that this will encourage further conversations on this extraordinarily important subject. And I'd also like to invite the audience to attend future sessions in this series, which will include upcoming conversations between Norman Wirzba and Stephen Chapman, and another between David Goatley and Peter Cazzarella, among others. And Professor Davis and Dr. Wells, thank you so much for your time today. And to everyone in the audience, thank you so much for taking the time to participate. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye.